Hi guys, and welcome to your episode 3 breakdown on the journey of Elaina. Today's episode was very different from what we've seen so far, and it's a complete tonal shift. Let's discuss it. It's a story of two parts, but they've kind of both got the same underlying message. Let's discuss the first half first, which is titled A Girl as Pretty as a Flower. We open very nicely on Elaina flying through a forest, and again, just this anime doing lighting justice. It's really pretty lit. You can really believe that she's flying through a forest where the light is dappled and it's on her face. She kind of regrets her choice to fly through the forest, and that's when she sees a beautiful clearing full of flowers. This is when we get our foreshadowy vibe. Foreshadowy sentences, and these kind of set the tone for the entire episode. Beautiful flowers have thorns, and beautiful things can bare their fangs when you touch them. And that's when it kicks off into our opening credits. Those initial lines set off my suspicious vibes straight away, where I went into this anime episode going, I don't trust anybody, and I'm now looking for stuff. It's a very clever episode. It leaves you feeling a little bit put out. So let's discuss it first. So our first chunk is where Elaina spots a girl in a flower field. We find out from her, we don't really get a name, which is fine. We just call her the flower maiden. She is in the field. She says that it grows naturally and she likes flowers. That's why she's there. She notices Elena's badge and she says, "Can I ask you a favour? And can you bring these bouquets to the country you're about to enter?" Where Elena's like, "Who should I give it to?" And what set off my little tingling sensation was when she goes, anyone. She wasn't specifically going, "You need to give it to this person." She just says, "Give it to anybody because someone's going to think they're beautiful." And that's when Elaina just goes, "Sure, I'll take on this task, that's fine." And we enter our new town, where as she's flying towards the entrance, they all seem to have like these little walled villages and they enter. I'm going to tell you exactly what this anime now reminds me of at the end because it was screaming to me throughout the entire episode. We'll get there, and I'll promote that anime too because it was a really good anime. She's flying through and the guard notices the flowers where he chases after her, but because he calls her girl, and Elena's really... As much as I love Elaina, she's a little bit... She doesn't like being belittled, which is fine, but at the same time she loves it when people praise her, so she's got that kind of slightly sadistic side to her where she enjoys people fawning over her. So someone calling her a girl is kind of below her, so she flies off ignoring him. But he literally kind of runs off after her. He snatches the bouquet from her. What I did notice was everybody's wearing these face masks. So this really is the town of COVID. Everyone's wearing face masks and these face protections, and I was like, okay, that's a bit of an odd bit of armour going on. Is it possible? And I started putting two and two together. I was like, is it possible that the flowers are toxic, or these guys are wearing these masks for a reason because something toxic or something dangerous is on their board? As he's taking the flowers from her, we see a higher up approach, and he's like, give it back. And the boy says, "I recognise the shawl. Could it be?" And that's when he's told to go home. And the higher up tells us that the boy's sister went missing. What sparked all the kind of connecting the dots in my head was the fact that the boy looks like the girl from the field. I was like, it's definitely the girl from before. That girl in the field is definitely his sister. And I got these dark vibes. I was like, why is she not in the city? Why is she gone missing? And lots of little things started to pop up in my head. So the anime did a very good job on starting to create questions. It was making me question what's going on and why do I feel uneasy. This entire episode I just got this vibe of uneasiness, and it might have been those opening lines I think felt a little bit off. Flowers are not allowed in this city, where the guy says the flowers are poisonous, and it makes normal people who are muggles who can't do magic, makes them insane. So the flowers lead the people away to the fields where the people become food for the flowers. It gets really dark, and like I said, it's a very tonal shift from our first few episodes. This episode probably is the darkest episode so far because we get quite a few. Our body count, we're going to start getting I didn't think I'd be doing a body count for Elaina, but there's a body count this episode. We get the first flashback. So we get two stories this episode as well, which are from the past, where Elaina tells us a story from the book of Nikki. So when she was a child, obviously, the reason why she wants to go travelling is because she read Nikki's books and she's like, I want to do that. Nikki in her books mentioned a strange plant. This flower absorbed magic and it mutated. So it started to mutate and it grew very violent. I like the way that the story is illustrated with proper pen and ink drawing. It feels like we're looking at a medieval book. It gave me a sense of age, which is quite nice. We cut to Elaina going back to the flower field, where we can see the boy from before surrounded by roots. He's been engulfed by a plant. And he says that the shawl was his sister's, so it led him to the flower field. And that's when we see that the flower girl from before is a flower. Either she's turned into a flower or she was the reason why people are dying, being brought to her. And that's why I was like, wow, this is a 180 on tonal shift right here. From last episode's kind of clingy awkwardness to a complete tonal shift. And I don't dislike it. I wasn't expecting it, but I like it. I think it's quite nice that something which looks so pretty, the entire anime, as I've been saying through the last few breakdowns, this anime is beautiful. This anime is so colourful. It looks beautiful. But there's something darker going on, and from our first line, that beautiful things can bear fangs. So Elaina, as well, being a very beautiful anime, has dark undertones to it. The flower girl is literally a flower, and this is when the guy is fully engulfed by his roots. I initially put dies, but it seems that people who are engulfed in the roots in the flower field, they turn into zombies, are mindless, and they carry these flowers and they head towards the town. And that's where the first story of this episode cuts. So as I said before, it leaves you feeling a little bit put out because we don't really get any clarification on what happens. We don't get a tie-in. The story just ends. So we don't know what happened. We don't know if the town gets overrun by these monsters. We don't know if everybody in that village is now dead. We get a hinted ending. You guys are going to fully understand it when I mention this anime at the end because it's identical to the kind of formula here. Let's jump to our second chunk, and that is the bottled happiness. And we get another similar beginning where she's flying over a field and below her, a boy signals her to land. He is holding a bottle. He sees the badge and he tells her that I'm looking for happiness. So inside the bottle is the emotions of people, animals. These emotions are turned into magic and he puts it into the jar. So he refuses to let Elaina open the jar when she says, can I open it? And he's like, no, because you'll undo all of my hard work. And he says he's collecting it for a girl he likes, which is when we get our second story. I predicted the end before it happened. So we get a sick housebound wife where the husband decides, I'm going to go travel the world. I'm going to recreate these gorgeous images, bring it back and try and make my wife happy. And that's the premise of the story, where Elaina suddenly can't remember the ending and the boy asks what happens. He says, I bet he came back and she was healed. But I wrote right underneath, did she die? Either she died before he returned or did she die? I felt the story had a negative ending. I will again mention it when we get the punchline at the end. I'll mention it then, why I suddenly knew the story wasn't going to end well. The boy's name is Emil, so we're going to call him Emil, and Emil's crush is on Nino, a servant within his household. Always going well when it's a master-servant situation going on. So the next section is where Emil and Elaina are flying together, and he tells us something which links in the first chunk, where he says, I tried to catch happy feelings from plants, however, that failed. Which is a slight link to the first chunk, and Elena's like, thank God you didn't become food for the plants. Nod back to the first half of the episode. And then we get a nice little funny moment. This is probably the only comic relief moment of the entire episode, where Elena's being called out for her lack of interest, and she kind of goes OTT sarcastic Elaina. She's like, oh, you are so rich, yes! And it's like, oh, you're sarcastic, but I love it. It's just the only little light-hearted moment before we go dive bombing into something dark again. This entire episode just dark. He invites her to lunch where Nino's going to be making her lunch. Lucky Nino. Elaina at first is like, oh no, I've eaten. And then he's like, you have to come along. And he's like, what food don't you like? And we get the whole I don't like mushrooms thing. I don't get your hatred. I love mushrooms. Mushrooms are great. This is when we meet Nino, who is acting a little bit odd. And I even thought, she's holding something or she's got something in her hand, but we don't see what it was. But she's acting really odd. We then get the line where Emil says, Dad found her in the east. In my head, I was like, that's a bit of a weird word to use. I mean, she's a servant to the household, so you found your servant? I mean, most people don't willingly become servants. Normally they are hired as maids. So again, getting those suspicious tingle sensations going off. My detector was starting to flash warnings. Emil's like, oh, the village chief is so kind. And then obviously they discussed what they're going to be making for dinner. We're going to have fish for dinner. It does look like Nino is scared when he mentions the chief, and she's like, "Oh yeah, no, he's really really kind. It's fine." I'm like, "No, you're scared of him." She's definitely acting odd, and she's clearly terrified of the chief. And the chief arrives, and we can see exactly why she is terrified. This guy, man, this is now this guy. Everybody, every episode of the of this week has had a this guy, and this is a this guy moment. He comes out and he just kind of closes the door really oddly, and I don't know why. I think he closed it fine, and there was nothing brought up about it. It's just the way he closed the door. I was like, that was a bit odd. I don't know why I didn't like that. That was just a bit odd. And then he glances Elaina up and down, and I'm like, I don't like this. I feel like it's going somewhere even darker than it actually went. And we just get this tension where he pours himself a glass of wine. And I did think he was going to smash the glass in his hand. It's just the way the hand animation was animated. It looked like he was going to break it. After an awkward dinner, we have Elaina asking the chief about Nino. She's like, wow, so you found her in the east. And it turns out he bought her as a slave. That's when Emil startles Nino, who then breaks the water jug, and she looks utterly terrified. Where our chief, who's already given me bad vibes, decides to show his true colours, and he calls her a worthless piece of junk and tosses her down to the ground. Emil tries to stand up to him, but he's pretty useless. Where Elena's the one who fixes everything. She's like, it's okay, you don't have to clean it up. There's this moment where she's holding her wand out in the direction of the chief, which is just, it's awkward. It's like she's either trying to restrain herself from not attacking him, and then she goes to clean up the jar. The chief says sorry, but he's really, really nervous. He's like, I'm so sorry, you saw something so disrespectful. And he's the kind of man whose reputation is very important to him. So he can see that suddenly he's like underestimated Elaina, and now she's actually pretty decent at magic. He's like, oh my goodness, I should try and patch things up a little bit. Outside quickly, we see Emil kicking out his frustrations because he's like, I could have done some magic too. But the thing is, dude, you didn't. You cared, but you didn't. Elena's like, maybe you should show Nino her present. Where we get another very odd scene, and he presents Nino with the bottle of happiness where she opens it. And we get this rainbow cloud where we can see all these very happy memories. And that's when she starts to cry. And this is when I'm like, I don't think she's happy, dude. I think it's backfired. And my big brain was ahead of the curve here. As Elaina leaves, she then remembers the rest of the story. So the story about the wife who was housebound and the husband. He came back and showed her all these beautiful scenes. So unlike my ending where I thought she'd died, which isn't quite far from the truth, she was alive when he got back. But the problem is him showing her all those gorgeous scenes made her very, very depressed because she couldn't go anywhere. And then it looks at the knife and it hints that she committed suicide. The moral of the story at the end, just because you are doing something for somebody, it doesn't make it right. So sometimes you might feel like you're doing something good for somebody, but it can have an adverse effect. And we get a very dark line, which just ends the entire episode. I don't know what happened to Nino, but I don't want to know. One of the darkest episode endings I've seen in quite a while, because essentially I also think Nino either committed suicide or she's tried to run away or she's just been murdered by this guy who is an a-hole. This reminds me, so last season, if you guys have joined me from last season, I mentioned the story of the bird in the cage, just because it came up in the Koi to Producer episode from Lucian, and we learned about the bird in the cage. A guy thought a bird was so beautiful he decides that he wants to protect it from the world, and he puts it in a cage. And the bird sings, but he thinks it's beautiful, and he's like, the bird's singing because it's happy. If you look at the story from a different perspective, the bird's now trapped. The bird is singing because it longs to be free. It's singing in a sad way to try and comfort itself because it knows it's never going to fly again. Hopefully I've got the imagery and the actual stuff I had from last episode. I'll throw it up on the screen now. It's a really dark story. Emil is trying to do something nice. He's like, oh my God, I'm going to get you a jar of happiness because you look sad. at the end of the day, what would have made her probably happier is actions. You giving her a jar, showing her how happy everybody else is, doesn't make her happy herself. It doesn't solve the issue. So this episode, it's very cleverly done. It's got some very strong morals, and it's also a very big tonal shift from last episode. At the same time, it does end on those open endings where you might be angry at Elaina for not doing anything, because obviously she had magic and she could have maybe freed the girl. But at the same time, it's one of those things where it's not Elena's place to get involved. It's definitely a very philosophical episode where you've got quite a few philosophical questions thrown up. And what I want to mention quickly is Kino's journey. And hopefully some of you guys are going to have noticed source material here and go, yes, 100% yes. It came out a few years back. I don't know how old this is. 2017, there we go. It came out in 2017 and it was called Kino no Tabi, which is a beautiful world. This and Elena's journey may as well be brother-sister animes, because Kino's journey was the same. Kino would go from town to town, country to country as a traveller, like Elaina. And each episode you just get a new town or a new story in this case. Your plot line for each episode is generally something quite small. So in this sense, last episode it was about the girl. This episode we've just got Elaina meeting some troubled people who've got situations that are very similar. And even in Kinos, there's one episode where Kino goes to a town and it's all led by violence. So violence is allowed. The thing is, it's not Kino's duty to sort the violence out or solve the matter. Kino and Elaina are both viewers looking in, travelling around, going into these countries where we're seeing a brief overlook. They are simply watching. It's very unlikely one traveller is going to change the fate of an entire town for good, even though we can see that meeting Elaina or Kino is going to have a effect on hopefully these people. And if you haven't watched Kino's journey, I definitely recommend maybe just checking out 2017's version. It is based on a book as well, so if you are in a mood, there is a book. I think the author is Keiichi Sigazawa. If you are interested in this world hopping, being a traveller, these kind of animes, this is the anime for you, definitely. Today's episode I thought was actually really good, and I enjoyed today's episode more than I enjoyed episode 2. Episode 1 and episode 3 have been my favourites so far. This episode was a complete tonal shift and it was done very clever. It kind of gives you a flavour of what the anime itself is going to be like. It's going to be Elaina and her journeys. It's her journeys, it's not her changing the world. It's a slightly different style of anime where Elena's not here to fix everybody's problems. She is a traveller. She is exploring the world that she's in, and we are encountering these people who have got these problems or have got these situations where Elaina plays the role as an observer. Her duty is to write her book. That's what she's doing. She's travelling the world, writing a book. Positive of this episode is it gets us all to think about these moral questions. What happiness truly is. Happiness is more than experiencing somebody else's happiness. Happiness to each and every person is an individual thing. What makes me happy won't make you happy. My love of mushrooms, you might be a complete hater of mushrooms. This is a very clever episode. It was an enjoyable episode to see, and I'm looking forward to seeing where the journey takes us next. These kind of animes are always very difficult, I find, to overall pass a judgment on, because every episode is a story in its own. So we're breezing through different stories, where last story about the girl in the town and her sister didn't really float my boat. I wasn't engaged enough, but then next story is darker and it's more engaging to me. I enjoyed it. We had the vibe straight off the bat. I was feeling nervous. I was like, there's something darker going on. And that's what we got. Well done, Elaina, for reminding me of Kino's journey, because it has the same vibes. A very, very good episode. I really enjoyed it. I think the storytelling in Elaina is subtle, but it is really clever. When you first look at Elaina and all the artwork for it, you're like, ooh, this is so pretty. There's no way that such a pretty anime can be hiding something darker. And when the darker tonal stuff comes up, it hits you and has a bit more of an impact when it's in your face. So I've had a great episode. I enjoyed this episode. I can't wait for next week. I will join you guys again Monday for Golden Kamui Season 3, Tuesday for Moriarty, Wednesday for Ikeburo Westgate Park and Noblesse, and Friday again for the journey of Elaina. Have a good one, guys. Make sure you subscribe because it really helps me out. Please help a growing channel. I really do appreciate absolutely everybody, and I do try to get back to everybody's comments. At the moment, I'm doing quite well. I think I've got back to every comment on the channel. So doing my best here. Hopefully you guys can join the noodlings, the fellow noodlings that are the Clockwork Dandy noodles. Together we will come together and become a ramen bowl, all together, joined together by the source that connects us, that is our love for anime. Have a good one, guys. Bye bye.